Today, we're gonna make something like this in Apple Motion. I'm gonna make a new project. So this is my settings. Let's create a drop zone. So Command-Shift-D. Let's rename it as Media. Then let's create a new group. Command-Shift-N. And let's import some image. Let's rename this as Media_02. Okay. Then the next step, let's duplicate this Media02 twice, 1 and 2. Let's rename one of them as the base and the other one as top. Then let's create a new group, Command-Shift-N. Then inside this group, let's rename it as the paper. Let's add an object generator and color solid. Change it to white. Then let's mask this, Option B. So you can fine-tune it later. Then the next step is we're gonna add some mask on our top. So Command-Shift-M. Then drag this paper here. Then this top group, let's add a page curl effect. So filters, distortion, page curl. Let's uncheck animate. Then let's change the angle and rotation around here. Let's turn up the base so that we're not confused, and also the media. Let's go back to page curl. Then from around maybe here, 0 at first frame, let's set it to 0. Then around 1 second, let's set it to 100%. So we will have this. Let's adjust the keyframe handles just a little bit. Okay, let's turn on our media. So we will have this. Let's adjust the position of media to be above or to be below the base. Then here on the base, let's add a mask also, Command-Shift-M. Then drag the paper. Then Invert Mask. So we will have this, top and base. Then this paper, let's duplicate this. Put it like that. So turn it on and turn up the top and base. Then here on the paper copy, go to the Bezier mask and check Invert Mask. So we will have this. Then here on the paper, let's add some drop shadow so that we will have some kind of depth, just like this. Let's turn on our base again. So we will have this already. Next thing we need to do, because if we look closer to our top, you can see that there's some outline which we don't like. So go to top, then here on the image mask, click this one, go to filters, go to stylize and min max. Change the mode to maximum and then increase the radius until the sharp edges disappear. Okay, let's group our paper and media. Let's rename it as media app. Then let's group them, Command-Shift-N. Then put them in that group, all of them. Let's rename it as paper tier. Here on the scale, let's animate this. Here on the Y scale, add parameter behavior link. Then drag that there in the source well, the paper tier group. Source parameter, properties, transform, and scale X. So doing that, we will have the Y scale linked to the X scale. So let's animate. Then change the handles. Then let's go again to our top and adjust the animation of our page curl. Then to make this much more interesting, let's go to our Media02. So it's the source for the base. Let's add some noise. Stylize, add noise. Change these settings. Then let's also add some hue and saturation. Maybe reduce the saturation for around like -0.05. Then add some contrast. Go to filters, colors, and color curves. Adjust the luma to a bit like this. Okay, so one thing I forgot is go to your media app here on the paper. So Bezier mask, let's adjust that. So edit points so that we can reveal some of the white. Then to add more, let's add some crystallized effects here on the Bezier mask. So filter, stylize, crystallize. So you will have this really rough edge. So reduce the speed and turn off smooth. Maybe size increase, it depends on you. Feathering, no feathering. So you will have this. Let's also drag this crystallize to our paper so that both will have that rough edge look. Okay, and then here on the page curl, change the back color to white, so it will look like this. So it also depends on you if you want to have this like transparent, but I'd like it to white, to set it to white, so it's like this. Next thing is I'm gonna add some texture to make this more and interesting. You can use any texture you want. I'm gonna use this white paper texture, increase the size. Then I'm gonna add some negative filter, so I will have this. Then I'm gonna add some levels filter, so filters, color, and levels. Then I'm gonna adjust this handles here, so I only want the white part. Okay, so this one might look good. Then I'm gonna animate the rotation. And then change the blend mode to screen. Then do some minor adjustments because currently our paper texture is too much. I'm gonna go to levels, then adjust this more. Then one thing I forgot, go to groups on my paper tier, then fix resolution. I'm gonna apply some offset filter, which is available here on the tile offset. I'm gonna keyframe the vertical offset around maybe 15 frames. Okay, then okay, 300 is quite good. Then adjust the handles also. Okay, so that's how to create a paper tier effect in Apple Motion. I hope you enjoyed this one. Don't forget to subscribe so that you're notified whenever I upload a new tutorial for Apple Motion. Thank you and see you again next time.